Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the NEIU Libraries, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event. I'd like to begin by thanking those who made this event possible. Funding for this event has been generously provided by the NEIU Library Foundation, the NEIU History Department, the NEIU Political Science Department, and the NEIU Sociology Department. Thanks also to Dan Chetto and Henry Stewart for making it possible for us to use this space today. The format for today's event will be as follows. Our guest speaker will give a presentation for approximately 30 minutes. After this, a panel of 3 Northeastern students will pose a number of pre-prepared questions to him for the next 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll open up the conversation for audience Q&A before drawing the event to a close around 1:45 p.m. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Crystalynn Ortiz. Crystalynn received her undergraduate degree in history from Northeastern. She's a member of Phi Alpha Theta, the National History Honor Society. In 2021, Crystalynn founded the NEIU History Club, and she served as its president for 3 years. In 2022, she was awarded the Diversifying Faculty in Illinois Fellowship, the goal of which is to increase minority tenure-track faculty and staff at Illinois colleges and universities. Also in 2022, she began pursuing 2 master's degrees at Northeastern, a Master of Arts in History and a Master of Arts in Teaching for Secondary Education. She completed the latter degree this summer. After earning her second MA, Crystalynn plans to pursue a PhD.
Hi, thank you, Ed. On behalf of the NEIU History Club, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's conversation. And it is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Musa al-Gharbi. Musa al-Gharbi is a sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. His research primarily focuses on the political economy of knowledge production and the social life of scholarly and journalistic outputs. He is a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing also appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, among other publications. Al-Gharbi's first book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, was published by Princeton University Press earlier this month. As a member of the new Heterodox Academy campus community here at Northeastern Illinois University, I'd like to add that Dr. Al-Gharbi is an active member of the Heterodox Academy, an organization that fosters open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement on college and university campuses throughout the world. Dr. Al-Gharbi, on behalf of the entire Northeastern community, thank you for being with us here today.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for having me and for helping organize this event. I'm going to take a sip of coffee real quick so I don't give you a low-energy presentation. I want to give you maximum Musa here. All right. So the kind of main subject of my book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of the New Elite, the kind of main group of people that the book is about is a constellation of folks that I call symbolic capitalists. So symbolic capitalists are people who primarily work in industries where they're kind of working with data and symbols and rhetoric and ideas instead of doing things like providing physical goods and services to people. So if you want to understand who symbolic capitalists are, you can think about people who work in professions like consulting, law, finance, education, media, science and technology, and so on. People like myself, and likely many of you downstream. And so yeah, if you're in this room, you're almost certainly a symbolic capitalist, or you're someone who's aspiring to the symbolic professions. One of the things that's interesting about symbolic capitalists compared to most other Americans is that we have this kind of really interesting relationship with social justice, which in a couple of ways. So first, a lot of our professions, a lot of the jobs that we aspire to are defined in terms of their commitment to altruism and serving the common good. So for instance, to use my own professions, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power and to be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone else's economic interests or political interests and so on. We're just supposed to tell the truth and study the truth. If you look at the American political and cultural landscape, if you look at like which Americans are most likely to self-identify as anti-racist, as feminists, as environmentalists, as allies to LGBTQ people, it's mostly people who work in the symbolic professions. The kinds of discourse and modes of engagement that are associated with what people colloquially and sometimes derisively refer to as wokeness are not the ways, this isn't the language of the trailer park or the ghetto or the global slum. This isn't the language and the ways of carrying ourselves that are definitive of people of less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. In fact, people of less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds often struggle to perform social justice discourses the right way when they get folded into elite institutions. And it's often a source of significant tension and discomfort. Symbolic capitalists are overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party politically. And this kind of affiliation with the Democratic Party goes back now decades and has become even more and more pronounced. In a lot of fields, like in my field of sociology, Democrats outnumber Republicans roughly 10 to 1. In journalism, it's the same. And a lot of other, in higher ed as a whole, liberals tend to outnumber conservatives, or Democrats outnumber Republicans, depending on how you slice the data, by roughly 5 to 1. And that ratio has been growing bigger over time. And so the core puzzle that the book wants to explore is one thing that's interesting is that starting in this period between World War I and World War II, and then especially accelerating after the 1960s, there were these changes to the global economic order that favored symbolic capitalists, that favored symbolic professions. So people who work in fields like journalism, media, finance, tech, and so on, consulting, we have a lot more power and influence over society than ever before. More and more wealth is being concentrated into our hands. Institutions and political processes are increasingly subordinated to our will. And so what you might expect is that as people like us have grown in influence and affluence, as more wealth and power and clout and status is in the hands of people like us, you might expect that a lot of long-standing social problems would be getting ameliorated, that inequalities would be shrinking, that there'd be growing trust in institutions because of all the great work that we're doing. Instead, you see the opposite. You see growing institutional mistrust, growing institutional dysfunction. In many cases, over the last, along with many dimensions over the last 50 years, growing inequalities, a lot of social problems that we committed ourselves to addressing, that we promised would be mitigated by people like us if we were given power. A lot of those social problems have not only persisted, but grown worse. And so the main thing that the core puzzle that the book is trying to wrestle with is basically, what's going on here? Like, why does the world that we live in, the kind of society that we ushered in, the society that we preside over, why does it look so different than the society that we promised? Why is it that despite our growing power and influence, a lot of things seem to be getting worse, not better, or social problems seem to be persisting rather than being addressed? And symbolic capitalists have kind of two answers that we like to offer for that question. So why does the world look the way it does? Why is it so far apart from the world that we promised? Our two stories are those damn Republicans and the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations, represented here by a shadowy MAGA guy and a cartoon guy with a bag of money, presumably laughing at poverty. Anyway, there's kind of the problem with our preferred narratives about what's wrong with the world and why things look the way they do is that these preferred narratives don't actually explain as much as we think they do. They actually do a pretty poor job of explaining why society looks the way it does, why institutions function the way they do. So I'm going to spend some time briefly walking through each of these explanations. Let's start with those damn Republicans. So when you look at Chicago and Illinois, I'll actually move the mic here so I can walk briefly. So when you look at Chicago and Illinois, so looking at the state level, Illinois according to the Economic Policy Institute, has the largest gap between black Americans and white Americans in terms of unemployment rate, 7.2 full percentage points, which is enormous. According to Wallet Hub, Chicago ranks dead last in racial equality, looking at a number of measures, whether you're looking at things like poverty or homelessness or employment, or the share of white people and black people in executive positions. No matter how you slice it, Chicago ranks near the bottom. Chicago has some of the biggest rates of racial inequality in the country. According to the Archbridge Foundation, Illinois is one of the worst states in the union for social mobility. And yet, there's a ton of wealth here. 1 out of every 22 people. If you grabbed 23 random people in Chicago and put them in a room, one of them would be a millionaire or a billionaire. Enormous amounts of wealth concentrated in the city, yet 1 out of every 6 residents of Chicago falls below the poverty line. According to the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, Chicago has the fourth most racially segregated urban area, and there's also huge amounts of crime in Chicago. It's been getting better, but relative to US averages, relative to the state of Illinois as a whole, relative to a lot of other major metropolitan areas, crime and crime victimization in Chicago is high. And so why is that? Who is to blame for that? Who should we hold to account for this state of affairs? Well, certainly not Republicans. So here's a picture of Chicago City Council. There's 50 seats. 3 of them are independents, 47 of them are Democrats, so nearly exclusively Democrats. You can look at the Illinois State Assembly. Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1. You can look at the mayor of Chicago, he's a Democrat. You can look at both of Chicago's senators are Democrats. You can look at the House of Representatives. Almost everyone from the Illinois delegation are Democrats. So Republicans are not responsible for any of this stuff that you see here. Republicans are not the ones making the decisions. Republicans are not the ones calling the shots. Democrats control Chicago and Illinois with basically one-party rule. So we can't actually explain any of the unfortunate trends or tendencies that we see in Illinois or Chicago by blaming those damn Republicans. The Republicans have a ghost presence in Chicago and a very marginal presence in Illinois as a whole in terms of actually controlling levers of power. So simply put, the GOP is not the main problem in Chicago, and the same is true for a lot of other knowledge economy hubs. If you look at Manhattan, if you look at Los Angeles, if you can break down, then you see the same kind of picture. It's Democrats who control basically everything in a lot of these cities that have extraordinary rates of inequality, large rates of poverty, despite immense wealth, and so on and so forth. It's blue states and blue cities where a lot of these problems are most pronounced. And so if aliens came down to Earth and just abducted Donald Trump and everyone who has ever voted for him, a lot of these problems would persist unchanged. They wouldn't change at all. You could just disappear all of the people who ever cast a ballot for Donald Trump, and a lot of these problems would disappear because the people who vote for Donald Trump are not driving any of this. They're not controlling anything here, not really, not at the political level. And given the immense amounts of wealth, again, 1 out of every 22 residents in the city is a millionaire or a billionaire, and other knowledge economy hubs are similar. Given the immense amount of wealth that's in our institutions, given the fact that Democrats control a lot of these cities with one-party rule, it would be completely within our power, if we wanted to. We could completely upend the distribution of wealth in America without worrying about Republicans at all, simply by leveraging the institutions that we control, that Democrats control, by leveraging the cities that Democrats control with basically one-party rule. It's completely within the power of a lot of us to completely change the distribution of wealth and status and power in our institutions. It's not that the Republicans are stopping us. There's no Republicans stopping us. The problem is that we're choosing to do things that exacerbate a lot of the social problems that we condemn and that we're really concerned about. Okay, so that's those darn Republicans. What about the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations? So there's a great book pictured behind me by Anandra Paradas. It's called Winners Take All. And what Jared Herodes argues in this book is that millionaires and billionaires like to leverage philanthropy to present themselves as a solution to problems that they themselves created. So all these rich and powerful people and these multinational corporations, they create all of these problems in society in their single-minded pursuit of wealth. And then in order to absolve themselves of blame for those problems and paint themselves as actually the good guys, they create and fund all of these nonprofit initiatives that make them look like these noble, benevolent, philanthropic souls when they're the ones driving a lot of the problems. Okay, so it's a great book, highly recommend. Buy my book first. But it's a great book. But in a way, the scope of Jared Herodes' argument is too narrow. And you can see this when you take any kind of a deep organizational look at how this alchemy, how this voodoo that Jared Herodes describes, how it actually plays out. So like, who is it that's running the PR firms through which these wealthy and powerful people leverage their, launder their reputations? Oh, that would be symbolic capitalists. We're the ones who are the PR agents. Okay, well, who are the journalists who write these fawning profiles of the millionaires after their donations to help convince people that these are great guys who are solving the problems? Oh, the journalists, they're symbolic capitalists too. Well, who is it that is doing the cool financial maneuvering that allows them to kind of launder their wealth through these nonprofits and save on taxes and avoid liabilities? Oh, that would be symbolic capitalists too. Who is it that administers the nonprofits that we're talking about, through which they're like, oh, that's us too. Almost every step of the process that Jared Herodes describes, if we look at who's actually doing the thing, it's us. We're doing the thing. Almost anything that we condemn about millionaires and billionaires and multinational corporations, it's with us and through us, symbolic capitalists, that these things happen, and they couldn't happen without us. As another example, Amazon has like abysmal worker protections. They really squeeze their workers hard. They have these extreme productivity demands. They surveil their workers very intensely. If you don't make your productivity demands, you can be not only fired or docked, but your whole team can be docked too. And you're surveilled aggressively by machines and sometimes wearables and cameras everywhere and all of this kind of stuff to make sure that you're focused. And so the productivity demands at Amazon lead them to have extraordinary rates of injury, death, and turnover relative to anyone else who works in this space. Anyone else who does a lot of shipping and goods and services to people, Amazon has really extreme and extraordinary rates of injury, death, and turnover for workers. And one, it should be noted, symbolic capitalists are the primary consumers. I mean, we're the market that Amazon is speaking to. But we're the ones ordering all the packages to our door instead of going to the store. But let's set that to the side. As a solution to this problem of worker injuries, Amazon decided that rather than adjusting their productivity and surveillance practices, which drive a lot of the unsafe behaviors, rather than doing that, what they're going to do is they'll put workers in cages. It's a twofer. You can actually surveil them even more and constrain them even more, keep them on task even more, while also saying that you're doing things to keep them safe. So rather than changing the productivity demands that drive the injuries, just cage up the workers. And this plan became public, and it was canceled after a lot of public outcry. But again, like, who came up with the worker cages idea? It wasn't Jeff Bezos. It was some functionary sitting in an office somewhere at Amazon who doesn't view the warehouse workers as people in the same way that he's a person and all his kids are people, and decided to try to shave the bottom line a little bit or avoid sacrificing any of the bottom line by putting their workers in cages instead of addressing the safety concerns. And this kind of a thing, again, if you want to understand the multinational corporations, the millionaires, the billionaires, any of this stuff, it's us who are driving to it. So if we kind of pay attention to how institutions and organizations actually work, symbolic capitalists have to be a big part of the picture. We're some of the primary beneficiaries and some of the primary drivers of a lot of the social problems we condemn. We actually can't understand a lot of the things we condemn about society just looking at the millionaires and billionaires. I'll give you an example, even looking at distribution of wealth. So the top 1% of America controls 27% of the country's wealth. That's a hugely disproportionate share. 1% controls 27%. It's hugely disproportionate, but notice it's not a majority. It's not even close to a majority. The top 1% doesn't control anything close to a majority of the country's wealth. So if you just focus on the top 1%, you actually miss most of the wealth in America. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. Let's look at the top 20% of America, which is to say, let's include the rich and the upper middle class. Well, if you look at the top 20% of America, you can account for 72% of America's wealth. 72%, the vast majority. The rest of the 80% of America has to make do with 28% of the country's wealth. Because the rich and the upper middle class hoard a lot of these resources for ourselves. You can't actually understand, as Richard Reeves and others have demonstrated in their research, you can't actually understand a lot of things like growing inequality, economic stagnation, lower social mobility, just looking at the 1%. You actually have to fold in both the millionaires and billionaires. Yes, you shouldn't exclude them from analysis, but you also have to include the upper middle class. We're the ones driving a lot of the trends that are adverse, or as Taylor Swift put it, I'm the problem, it's me. And one of the challenges for symbolic capitalists to kind of understand the ways in which we contribute to a lot of the social problems we condemn is that it's really hard for us to think of ourselves as elites. By almost any measure, we are elites. We exert much more cultural influence than other people. We have a lot more wealth than other people. Policymakers are a lot more sensitive to our concerns and much more responsive to our concerns, and so on and so forth. By almost any measure of who you would identify as the elite in society, symbolic capitalists are elites. But we don't think of ourselves that way. We don't think of ourselves that way for two reasons. First, because a lot of our professions, again, were kind of rooted in checking elites and holding elites to account. We were supposed to be this conduit of taking the needs and desires of people at the bottom and conveying them to people at the top, and taking resources and stuff from people at the top and channeling them down to people at the bottom. That's not the way it works in practice. Example, there's a sociologist, Randall Collins, who has a great book called The Credential Society. And he looks at the period of the 1920s and 1910s when a lot of our professions were created in their current form. And two other big things happened during this period. One, there was a passage of the income tax got passed for the first time and defended in the Supreme Court. So we could tax the millionaires and the billionaires and the rich people. And two, we saw the creation of big philanthropic organizations in the mature form that we understand today. So these two developments happened at the same time. And as a result, you saw this massive transfer of wealth from Gilded Age elites downwards. Okay, sounds great. But where did the money go? As Collins shows, the primary wealth transfer that actually occurred during this period wasn't from the rich to the poor, it was from the rich to the upper middle class. Symbolic capitalists took from the wealthy and we gave to ourselves. And some small little bit of that did end up trickling down to the people who were disadvantaged. There were programs that were created, there was good that was done. But the vast majority, the primary wealth transfer, the primary beneficiaries, was us. And because we often think of ourselves in opposition to elites, those bad elites, and because we often think of ourselves as being deeply committed to social justice and egalitarianism, it's really hard for us to kind of process the information about how we contribute to social problems, about how we are in fact elites. I had to dedicate an entire chapter of the book, chapter 3, to really hammering this point home. Instead of focusing on ourselves, instead of understanding ourselves as elites, instead of looking at the role that we play in perpetuating social problems, instead of doing that, we often expropriate blame to people we don't like, people who are sociologically distant from ourselves, people who have a lot less influence over society than we do, and who benefit a lot less from social problems than we do, so we blame people. who end up working in industries where they provide physical goods and services to people, so people who actually don't have the same leverage over institutions than we do, because they vote Republican. Or we blame people who live in flyover countries and small towns and rural areas who don't have nearly as much wealth or power as we do, and haven't benefited, and in fact have been suffering as a result of the transition to the symbolic economy. We blame those people for social problems because they vote Republican. And so on and so forth. So again, we blame those damn Republicans, and by proxy, the people who vote for those damn Republicans, even though those people don't have nearly as much power or influence as us, not on the political scale, certainly not in our states and cities, not even in the national scale. They don't have as much wealth or power, they don't have as much control over institutions, they don't have as much cultural influence, but we blame them for most of the social problems because we can't understand ourselves as elites, and we can't really think of ourselves easily as driving a lot of these dynamics. And so how does this, one of the core messages of the book, though, so the book focuses on this big gap between what symbolic capitalists profess and how we actually live. One thing that's important to stress, that I stress throughout the book, and that I think is super, 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 super important, is that the reason why we see this gap isn't because symbolic capitalists don't really believe when they call themselves, when they associate themselves with feminism or anti-racism or environmentalism. It's not the case that they're being cynical or insincere, or that we don't really want to see the poor lifted up, that we don't really want to see the marginalized people be included and live lives of dignity. We absolutely do want those things. But our commitments to social justice are not our only sincere set of commitments. We're also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think it's natural and appropriate that people should take our perspectives more seriously than they take the perspectives of a clerk checking out our groceries. If the two of us opine on some issue, we think our words should carry more weight. We think it's natural and appropriate that we have a higher standard of living than most people. We don't think that we should make the same as the people serving us food, and so on. And we want our children to reproduce our elite position. So not only do we want to be better off than most Americans, but we want our children to be the same as us, or better still. And this drive to be an elite is in fundamental tension with our drive towards egalitarianism. Like, you can't be an egalitarian social climber. It's a contradiction in terms. And so when these two drives, when these two sincere commitments come into conflict, as they regularly do, I argue it's usually the drive to be an elite that ends up winning out and transforming how we pursue social justice in two ways. First, it pushes us to try to pursue these social justice goals in ways that don't cost us anything, in ways that don't require us to change anything about our own lifestyles, about our own aspirations, about the aspirations we hold for our children, and so on. So we try to pursue social justice that doesn't require fundamental change or sacrifice from us. And that pushes us towards more symbolic gestures on the one hand, and then on the other hand, towards expropriating blame and trying to just take stuff from other people. But again, as I've highlighted repeatedly, there's not actually a way that we can just tax the millionaires and the billionaires and solve all these social problems. Because a lot of the social problems are created by us and with us and through us, that the billionaires and the multinational corporations and so on even exercise their will. So it's not a question of sincerity. It's also not like one of the things in the discourse is there's this kind of focus on hypocrisy. Oh, so what I'm doing in this book, the main thing that I'm doing in this book is not trying to show that symbolic capitalists are hypocrites. I don't even think hypocrisy really is interesting. Like, everyone's a hypocrite. If you believe in something, you're a hypocrite. And the reason you're a hypocrite is because the moral principles we subscribe to are often austere. They don't change, they're rigid, but the world that we have to navigate is complex, it's dynamic, it's fluid, We're operating with imperfect information. We're born into circumstances that were not of our making. We all have agency, but we also have constraints. And so as a result of these kinds of things, no matter what you believe, there's this gap, typically, between the world that we live in and the world that we aspire to. So hypocrisy is not like interesting, it's kind of the human condition for anyone who believes in anything. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean we should just go, oh, well, okay, well, hypocrisy, for two reasons. First, because this effort to bring the world, to unite these realms, to bring the world more into line with the world that we want to see. These efforts to unite these spirits is one of the main ways that we find purpose and meaning in our lives. It's immensely important for us in terms of living lives of fulfillment. And more importantly, though, because symbolic capitalists are elites, to the extent that we don't embody our values, to the extent that our lifestyles and behaviors don't reflect our goals, this matters. Like, it has practical implications. It matters a lot, especially for people who are from less advantaged positions than ourselves. It's those people who suffer when we don't live in accordance with our values. And so the hypocrisy doesn't matter in its own right. On right-leaning media, you'll hear people, oh, the woke people are hypocrites. Okay, yeah, but okay, you're hypocrites too, guys. I've got news for you. So the hypocrisy and the kind of counterclaims of hypocrisy, this kind of Spider-Man memeing of the hypocrisy, I don't think that's like really interesting. And again, I don't think people are cynical or insincere. I think they're sincere, but it's not our only sincere commitments, and that's a problem in a deep way. It's a tension that informed the symbolic professions from their outset and continues to flavor them today and drives a lot of social problems. So there's a number of other questions that the book explores other than this one. I won't go through them here. They're described in the introduction. I'll just briefly flag. So some of the other questions that the book tries to explore, the central questions are, why is it that people who benefit the most, that the people who are most concerned with what you might call ideological racism or sexism, that is, people thinking or saying or feeling the wrong things about race, gender, and sexuality, the people who are most concerned about that kind of ideological racism or sexism are also the people who benefit most from what sociologists describe as systemic or institutionalized racism or sexism. So we're the ones who actually exploit and benefit from racialized inequalities and gendered inequalities. We help perpetuate them, even though we're the ones most concerned about other people saying the wrong thing or thinking the wrong thing. And the book tries to figure out, like, why is that the case? How do those things fit together? To the extent that it's a genuine disadvantage to be African American or otherwise non-white, to be a gender or sexual minority, to be neurodivergent or disabled, to the extent that it's genuinely disadvantageous to be these things, which it is looking at macro data, people who are non-straight, non-white, non-able-bodied and neurotypical and so on, they do tend to have a lot worse outcomes looking at a lot of macro social data. So to the extent that it's a disadvantage to be those things, then why is it that elites, and especially elites more than anyone else in society, why is it that elites are so eager to lay claim to these very identities, these very stigmatized identities that are often foisted on other people against their will? Why is it that we trip all over ourselves to talk about how we belong to these different marginalized and disadvantaged groups, sometimes stretching the truth to do it? It's another puzzle that the book tries to work through. And then finally, for now, if a lot of our social justice-oriented activism doesn't achieve the goals that it aspires to, why do a lot of these things persist anyway? Why are they done despite there being no real relation between what we're doing and what we want to accomplish? What functions does our social justice advocacy serve if it's not actually helping the marginalized and the disadvantaged? These are some of the questions that the book tries to work through in addition to that central question that I've explored mostly in the talk today. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. If you want to contact me. You can go to my website. I have my email and socials. If you want to, beyond the book, I have a Substack where I kind of explore different issues that I didn't cover in the book, so feel free to check that out too. And in any event, thank you so much for having me. It's been great. I look forward to this.
Thank you, Dr. al-Gharbi. For the next portion, I know we'll read your book, and I personally really enjoyed it. But before we begin our questions about it, I'm going to introduce my fellow History Club members and those who are going to be interviewing you with me today. Jessica Makowski and Diana Catalano. Jessica received her undergraduate degree in history from Northeastern in the spring of 2023. She is currently pursuing a Master's of Arts in Teaching History for Secondary Education. She's a member of Phi Alpha Theta, the National History Honor Society, and she is the current president of the NEIU History Club. In 2022, Jessica was awarded the Bromwell-Lindbergh History Scholarship, and she's completed an internship at the Arlington Heights Historical Society and a fellowship with the Chicago History Museum's Chicago Learning Collaborative Education Initiative. After earning her MAT degree, Jessica plans to pursue a PhD in public history. Diana joins Northeastern Illinois University as an NEIU Star Scholarship recipient, transitioning from the City Colleges of Chicago. She's pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in History, complemented by a minor in economics, synthesizing her interests in historical analysis and economic theory. Diana aims to build upon her interdisciplinary foundation as she prepares for a career in securities law, with plans to pursue her Juris Doctor degree upon completion of her undergraduate studies. Okay, so Professor al-Gharbi, our first question for you is as follows. I know you referred to something called the Great Awakening as a pivotal moment in the evolution of contemporary social justice movements. Exactly when do you believe this Great Awakening began? Can you get us through the time period and what specific moment, or why did it happen at that moment versus any other time?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, chapter 2 of the book, what it tries to walk through is this period of, so like in the discourse, do you mind if I walk up, just I feel like fidgety. Okay. So in the discourse, there's a lot of talk about like something that seems to have changed, that there's this period of kind of rapid shifting and how a lot of people talk and think about social justice, how we engage in political activism, and so on. So one question that I try to investigate as a researcher is, how accurate is this perception that something shifted? Like, is it a moral panic? Is there a there? Like, to what extent? And so in chapter 2 of the book, and before this, colleagues and I have worked to try to empirically measure whether or not stuff changed. And you can see that there was this big shift. So for instance, a colleague and I, David Rosado, we did this project where we analyzed 27 million news articles from 47 media outlets over the last 50 years. And what we found is that after 2011, there was this radical shift in how the media talked about discrimination and disadvantage in particular. There was this immense spike that started after 2011 for all forms of prejudice and discrimination in terms of race, gender, sexuality, concerns about misogyny, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, pretty much all forms of racism and discrimination. Journalists started talking about them a lot more, all at the same time, not in a way that seemed to correspond with anything that was happening in the world. In fact, rather than it being the case that, say, the Great Awakening was a response to was caused, for instance, by Black Lives Matter, or Me Too, or Trump, or, the shifts actually predated the emergence of any of these things. And so the shifts that were already underway might help explain why it is, for instance, that Black Lives Matter was able to break through in 2013 when so many other movements for criminal justice reform and to bring attention to policing and mass incarceration, why so many of these other movements didn't break through in the same way. Likewise, why Me Too was able to succeed at the level, gain prominence at the level it did, despite other people trying to work on this for years. And you know, this kind of period of heightened cultural contestation, rather than being driven by Trump, might have been a product of that. Like the reason why Trump was able to kind of surf into office is by riding this wave of heightened cultural tension and disputation that was already underway. Okay, and so these shifts that we see in the media, you can also see them in entertainment outlets. You can see them in academic journal articles. You can see them in video games, as I showed on my Substack. There was a massive change in video games after 2011. You can see them in terms of political alignment. So who do symbolic capitalists vote for? Do they self-identify as liberal? You can see it in how we respond to polls and surveys. Like our attitude shifted immensely in terms of, especially on questions about race, gender, sexuality, and so on. And other Americans' views didn't shift as much. So there was this big gap that grew. And a lot of us recognize that there's this growing gap between us and other people, and we assume it must be because other people are growing more regressive, they're growing more sexist, racist, whatever. But actually, when you look at the data, they're not. They haven't changed much at all, and to the extent that they've changed, they've actually grown more progressive. And the reason why there's this growing chasm is because we shifted a ton. But it's really hard for us to see ourselves as shifting. We feel consistent. We feel like we hold like our president and our past are consistent, and that we hold our beliefs for these really logical, well-formed reasons. So we don't think of ourselves as having undergone these like radical changes in attitude, but we have. We have, and other people haven't, and so the gap has been growing bigger. Yeah, and so what I showed, so looking through a bunch of empirical measures, you can see that after 2010, there was this rapid shift along all of these different dimensions. But what's interesting, what I show in the book, is that the period of awakening we saw after 2010 was not unique. It was actually a case of something. And in fact, there have been 3 previous periods of awakening over the course of the 20th century. And so a lot of the things that we've used to explain why we saw this shift after 2010, we can see that a lot of those narratives are actually false. Like, for instance, it wasn't cell phones that caused the Great Awakening, because why would there have been an awakening in the 1920s if cell phones were the cause? It certainly wasn't Gen Z or kids these days, because again, why would these things have been going on for a century if it was driven by Gen Z? So we can rule out a lot of explanations for what's happening. We don't have to just explain what's happening today in terms of other things that are happening today. We could take and so what I show in the book is that by comparing and contrasting these different periods of awakening, we can get leverage on questions like, why do these awakenings come about? Why do they end? How does one inform the next? And so on. And so to briefly, why did the awakenings come about? I identified 2 factors that seem to be core predictors of awakenings. The first is that awakenings tend to arise during periods of elite overproduction, when it grows particularly acute. So what is elite overproduction? That's when society produces growing numbers of people who feel entitled to an elite lifestyle, but society doesn't have the capacity to give them the lives that they expect. So you can see this in the case of someone who, say, they went to college, they got good grades, they went to college, they graduated from college, they even went to the right college, they had a good GPA, and then they find themselves unemployed and underemployed. When you see growing numbers of elites, elite aspirants who find themselves in that kind of a position, what they tend to do is agitate against the order that they think failed them, try to topple existing elites to make room for themselves. And I argue, like, and so you can see one of the core predictors for when awakenings happen is when you have these kinds of growing numbers of frustrated elite aspirants. But elite overproduction in itself isn't enough to predict awakenings. And this is because oftentimes that are bad for elites are actually pretty good for other people. My advisor, Seamus Khan, illustrated in some of his research that there's this kind of counter-cyclical nature between fortunes of elites and non-elites. So times that are bad for other workers tend to be good for elites. We can exploit their labor at cheaper rates. We can coerce them into more or less favorable working conditions and so on because they're more desperate for employment. So times that are good for elites tend to be bad for normie workers. And on the flip side, times that tend to be good for normie workers are often bad times for elites. And so in many cases, when you have elite overproduction, it's hard for anyone to care. It's hard for us to get anyone to care. Like, no one's breaking out their tiny violin like, oh, boo-hoo, the poor elite that has to get a normal job and live a normal life like everyone else. But there are some times when these trajectories get collapsed, when things have been kind of bad and worse for ordinary people for a while, and all of a sudden they're bad for a lot of elites too. Those are the moments when awakenings tend to happen. Because not only do you have these frustrated elites, but you also have large numbers of people in society at large who also want to see things change, who also have a bone to pick with the prevailing order and the people who run it. And this provides not, so they don't just have the motive, but they have the means to exert different kind of leverage over institutions. And so those are the two big predictors that I identified.
Thank you, Professor al-Gharbi. So our second question is actually correlated to the first. So how do you see this current wave of social consciousness compared to previous great awakenings in terms of its long-term societal and political impacts? Are there unique beliefs or risks associated with this iteration that weren't present in earlier waves?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I highlighted in the book that I think will surprise a lot of readers is that there's a lot of continuity between these periods, like a lot, like mind-blowing. Like, I was disturbed as I was doing the research at how much consistency there was. So I include these excerpts, for instance, by Barbara Ehrenreich, who has this book called Fear of Falling, and she's writing in the 1990s about how student protesters in the 1990s and the ways that they were received and the narratives about kids these days, the specific narratives and so on, were basically identical to how student protesters in the 1960s were talking about. And reading this book in the 2010s, it was blowing my mind because it's the same narratives that she was talking about in the 90s that were also present in the 60s, were verbatim, the social scripts, the battle lines, identical across these periods. And even things like cancel culture, or a lot of things that like people assume that identitarianism is something new, but the 1920s Great Awakening. In the 1920s, you saw the first wave of feminism. You saw the New Negro movement. You saw the establishment of the first gay rights organizations. A lot of the, in fact, and even the kind of intersectional nature of social justice, even though the term intersectionality didn't exist, was quite present. So Orwell, for instance, has this great quote writing at the end of the first Great Awakening in the 1920s. He says something like, in this book, The Road to Leaving Here, something like, it seems like the words communism and socialism, almost as if with magnetic force, draw to them every fruit juice drinker, vegetarian, sex deviant, and so on, nature cure person, all of them in England just get drawn in by magnetic force to the words communism and socialism. Even cancel culture, so writing in the 1920s, well actually in the 1930s, about the 1920s, he says, sometimes when I look at left-aligned folks, it seems like what we're doing more than anything is beating drums saying, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of a right-wing deviationist. So this identity to identify heretics and kind of punish them. The phenomenon of cancel culture, it was called trashing in the 1960s, but it plays out almost verbatim. There's this great quote in the book by Joe Freeman, who describes cancellation in great detail in the 1960s, before Twitter, before cell phones. And so there's a lot of continuities. I think readers will be disturbed by some of the continuities. I was, like I said, as someone who operates on this kind of culture space, I was like, what the? Okay. But for all that, they're not identical. So the fact that this current awakening is happening in an age of smartphones and social media is a non-trivially affects the way the awakening plays out, right? It's a meaningful difference. And there are kind of two other things real quick that I think are important. that are different across the awakenings. One of them is that the share of people in society that are symbolic capitalists has been growing a lot over time. So in the first Great Awakening, symbolic capitalists were about 3% of workers. And so if you're 3% of workers, it's impossible for you to just ignore the rest of society or just impose your will on the rest of society and write off all the normies and that have a disdainful, like you have to actually, you're just compelled to compromise and find ways of engaging in common ground and persuade people in this kind of stuff. You just have to. Today, symbolic capitalists are about a third of workers. Still not even close to a majority, still a distinct minority, but 1 in 3 is a big share. And we're not just randomly distributed around the country, we're consolidated in these symbolic economy hubs, embedded in these tight institutions, these closely related institutions like academia, tech, finance, philanthropy that are kind of interlinked in all of this kind of stuff. And we as a result of this kind of consolidation, we actually are in a position where we can just ignore a lot of the rest of America. We can ignore their preferences. Corporations can take social stands that they know will alienate vast portions of America, but that play well with people like us, and they'll take that loss. They're willing to take that trade because we have a lot of more money and more is projected to be in our hands going forward. We're concentrated in these major media markets. It's very convenient to appeal to us, and so a lot of institutions are perfectly happy to ignore, deride, mock, anger the rest of America, and they can make money hand over fist doing it in a way that would have been impossible before. Likewise, you can have a party like the Democratic Party that really orients itself heavily around our values and priorities and our ways of talking and thinking about the world, and they can dominate whole cities and states with one-party rule, and they can even be really competitive on the national stage as long as they finesse things to fold in just enough normies to kind of have a workable coalition. And so, as we've grown bigger in number and become more concentrated, the awakenings have in some ways grown more pronounced because we're not really checked by outside people to the same extent. Like the enemy doesn't have the same kind of veto, to use a war analogy. And then another thing that's changed over each period is that symbolic capitalists have more wealth and control and influence across, over each of these awakenings to become more powerful and richer and have more control over institutions. And this matters because then disputes and instability within the symbolic professions is more destabilizing for society as a whole. If we're elites, but like kind of marginal, and we're kind of on the peripheral of society, versus if like almost everything runs with us and through us, and we're freaking out and losing our minds and getting into these bitter power shows, then that kind of a thing is much more destabilizing for society as a whole. The more powerful we become, the more wealth that's concentrated in our hands. So those are some of the differences, despite the immense similarities.
Thank you so much for your insight. Moving on to our third question, your book points out that many of the woke Americans have contradictory views. For example, as you detailed during the COVID-19 pandemic, many Upper West Side liberals in New York gathered under the campaign "Not in My Backyard" to protest the use of vacant hotels to house the homeless. Your book also recognizes that many of the causes that the symbolic capitalists support are well-intentioned but are not always acted upon in a productive way. What would you say are the defining factors that determine which causes this group will choose to support?
Yeah, I mean, as far as which causes we choose to support, I think one of the main considerations, as I detail in the book a little bit, so we have this, because a lot of our professions are oriented towards helping the marginalized and the disadvantaged and the least among us, the causes we tend to gravitate to in general tend to be causes that are oriented towards that, towards addressing, towards improving the position of the poor, of minorities, of women, of gender, of sexual minorities, and so So we tend to focus a lot on things like poverty and discrimination and things like this. Are the social causes that we tend to gravitate to. We actually gravitate a lot more towards the identitarian stuff, actually, than the socioeconomic stuff. So you can see, for instance, that when you look at charitable giving in the United States, the Americans who give the largest shares of their income and who give most consistently are not highly educated, relatively affluent, liberal people or professionals. It's actually people who are lower income, people who are conservatives, people who are Christians, people who live in more rural and small town areas. They actually give a lot more of themselves. They give more consistently. And they're the Americans who are most likely to give to causes that directly address human suffering and poverty. Whereas symbolic capitalists, not only do we give less and less consistently, but when we do give, we tend to give money to causes that are orthogonal to directly addressing human suffering. So things that are trying to improve people's social standing and status, or just the symbolic stuff. Or things that are, or we donate a lot to culture institutions like elite universities because they really need the money. So those are some of the causes that we tend to, so we tend to focus a lot on inequality, and especially on identity-based inequality. But the specific causes we gravitate to are somewhat opportunistic. And we operate, we gravitate towards them in an inconsistent, so during these periods of awakening, for instance, we tend to be really passionate about taking part in movements like Black Lives Matter. But in between awakenings, when symbolic capitalists are doing pretty well, a lot of these kinds of movements for social justice fall into abeyance patterns, which is to say, they become, our participation drops off significantly, our support drops off significantly. We just get to the grind and start making money and building a life for ourselves and helping our, and it's only when times are tough for us and we're in the middle of these interleague struggles that we tend to focus more on these social justice things in a way we didn't before. And so that's another big factor, is kind of just what's going on in the environment and in our own living conditions. When things are going pretty good for us, we often, a lot of the social movements that we're part of just kind of die down. And you can see this now. As the current Great Awakening is winding down, as the kind of elite crisis that started after the 2008 financial crisis seems to be winding down, at least especially for symbolic capitalists, you can see companies are slashing their DEI budgets and their DEI institutions. And our views are moderating on a lot of issues. We're protesting and taking part in social movements a lot less than we used to. We're just moving on with our lives. And of course, the kind of struggles, the things that we're concerned about, people living in poverty, people facing discrimination and prejudice and exclusion, their lives, they're continuing to face the same challenges. It's just we're not engaged with that so much anymore. We're moving on, and this is the kind of thing that you see at the end of each of the awakenings.
Thank you for that. That turned into call-out news very quickly. But our fourth question is as follows. In your case, or in your view, forgive me, how strong are the situational pressures for symbolic capitalists to emphasize these marginalized aspects of their identity, our identities? Do you see this emphasis on victimhood or marginalized status as a necessary product of our current social and professional landscapes? Have institutions shaped us to follow these cues?
I mean, it's definitely the case that institutions encourage us to follow these cues and to play this game, and part of what it means to succeed in many cases in the symbolic professions is learning how to play this game. So I'll give you a couple of examples real quick. So there's a lot of schools have moved away from standardized testing and placed more focus on things like essays to allow people to get into college, and they've made this move under the auspices of social justice and with the desire to diversify their student bodies. And fold in more disadvantaged people who might not have had the same kind of access to test prep and so on. Okay, but it turns out that essay content is even more strongly correlated with class than test scores are. And in particular, it's people from relatively affluent backgrounds who know how to tell the kinds of stories that tug on elite gatekeepers' heartstrings. So, for instance, when students from less affluent backgrounds talk about overcoming challenges, say, in a college essay, one, they're less likely to focus on identity. When they're talking about overcoming challenges, people from less advantaged backgrounds are less likely to feature identity as their story. They often focus on other challenges that they faced in their life. But even when they write identity-based issues, they tend to tell the wrong kinds of stories. So when they talk about overcoming challenges, they talk about the support that other people provided to them, and lucky breaks, and kind of changing social conditions that allowed them to do things that they couldn't have otherwise done. And that's not the kind of story you're supposed to tell. The kind of story you're supposed to tell is about how, as a result of your grit and hard work and determination, you succeeded and flourished in a system that wasn't built for you, in a hostile environment. And you came from the bottom and you rose to the top, but you still keep it real and you're committed to paying it forward. There's like a whole script, right? It's a very, people from less affluent backgrounds don't know the script. And so when you create a system where you have to tell these stories of poverty and trauma and overcoming disadvantage, ironically, it stacks the deck in favor of elites. It's elites, people from relatively affluent backgrounds, who are best positioned to tell those kinds of stories and flourish as a result of them. And so a lot of schools actually got less diverse, socioeconomically, ethnically, and otherwise, when they got rid of standardized testing, and as a result, some of them were reverse course. And this is an example of a broader trend, though, a broader social phenomenon, where the people who know how to tell the right stories, like one of the big things that you have to do to succeed in the game is learn how to tell the right stories. And I'll make it personal. So this book was published by Princeton University Press. It's about as good as it gets. There was a competitive auction for the rights to the book. It's extraordinary for something like that to happen, because at the time I sold the book, I was just a PhD student. It wasn't even my dissertation, it was a side project. So it's really unusual for a PhD student to sell a major book to the top university press with a competitive auction to the rights. Okay, great. So how did this happen? Well, one of the reasons it happened is because I was at Columbia. So this book criticizes at length the ways that elite institutions, and especially credentials from not just from college and universities, but from places like Columbia, the role that plays in shaping who we think is worth listening to, whose perspectives are valuable or valid. The book critiques this at length. But it's also a product of that very dynamic. If I was a student at the University of Arizona, where I started, or if I was a student at Stony Brook University, where I currently teach, which is both of them great R1 universities, but if I was a student at either one of those universities, and I pitched this exact same manuscript, it probably wouldn't have gotten picked up, probably not by Princeton, there probably wouldn't have been a competitive auction for the rights to it. The reason why so many people were interested in my voice and my perspective was because I was a student, I was an Ivy League intellectual. And this is true of my journalism stuff as well. Before I was at Columbia, I would pitch articles to the New York Times, and I wouldn't even get a no. I was below projection. But then when I moved to Columbia, editors at the New York Times started reaching out to me, just, hey, I'm an editor at the New York Times. Would you like to write for us about blah? And this wasn't because I became a much better writer in the time it took to move from Sierra Vista to Manhattan. It's 100% institutional effects and network effects. And so the book critiques this, but it's itself a product of it. And the same thing is true, actually, for the identity. This book criticizes the way that symbolic capitalists leverage identity to enhance their professional standing and further their goals. But it's also the case that part of the reason this book was published is because I'm black. Now, it's not the case that anyone who's black gets a Princeton book. You get a book, you get a book, you get a book. That is not the case. But if I was white and I wrote this same book, minus the autobiographic parts, And I wrote the same book, making the same arguments, especially, God forbid, if I had any stench of conservatism or Christianity on me, whoo! But because I'm an African, like the book would have been perceived as being too risky, too edgy, too dangerous, too controversial. But because I'm black and a Muslim and a columnist for The Guardian, I had to send all the right social signals. Not only was this book published, but again, it was published at basically the best press you can get, and there was a competitive auction to the rights. Never would have happened if it weren't for the fact that I'm a black Muslim and I write for The Guardian. So the book critiques these identity-based modes of social status and social advancement, but the book is itself a product of those very things it condemns. And, you know, rather than denying that, or just ignoring it, I think it's important to lean into it and to be forthright about it and to kind of reckon with and wrestle with these kinds of tensions. So the nice thing, though, so it's absolutely the case that there are all these social pressures. You're invited and encouraged and incentivized to kind of play this identity game to get ahead. And other people see these incentives, and this is why even some people who are not white or who are not, you know, and so on, actually kind of stretch the truth to kind of fold themselves into different marginalized identities. There's absolutely this incentive structure there. And the fact that if you belong to a historically marginalized and disadvantaged group, and you're someone whose position in these institutions feels precarious, or if there's just not a lot of other people who kind of, so that you don't feel like you have a base to kind of push back and say, look, you know, I'm not going to play this game, then you feel even more pressure to conform, right? And this kind of pressure to conformity, last thing I'll say, this pressure to conformity is one of the things that leads people to have to completely misunderstand how a lot of non-white, queer, and other people feel about a lot of social issues. Because to a lot of mainstream symbolic capitalists, it seems like everyone that they know who lays claim to a disadvantaged population agrees with them on all of this stuff. It seems that like everyone's on board and we're all on the same page. And, but that's not the case. Like if you look at, for instance, within the Democratic Party, who are the blocks of Democratic voters that are most skeptical of immigration? Well, that would be African Americans and Hispanics. Who are the blocks of Democratic voters that are really supportive of efforts to ban Islam or confront Islam? Well, that would be, again, black people and Hispanics, a lot of whom are Christians of various denominations that view Islam as a false and dangerous religion and are perfectly happy to suppress or exclude Muslims. Who is it in the Democratic Party that is most skeptical of, for instance, teaching young kids about LGBTQ issues or engaging in gender-affirming care for minors? Well, that would also be non-whites. And a lot of progressives, this is hard to wrap our head around because we often think in intersectional terms. We view a lot of these struggles as being deeply interrelated, part of the same system of oppression that we want to overthrow, we want to liberate everyone together. But that's just not the way that most non-white voters think about these issues. They absolutely do not view these struggles as being fundamentally interconnected. And what happens when we create when we create an atmosphere in higher ed that is hostile towards socially conservative or religious views or traditional modes of life or knowing and things like this, when we create that kind of atmosphere that's disdainful towards tradition and social conservatism, the people who suffer most from that are not the privileged cisgender heterosexual white males. The people who belong to the dominant population in academia also are really likely to subscribe to the dominant view in academia because they're the dominant party. It's their views that dominate. It's ironically, when we create an environment that's hostile towards these socially conservative and religious views in the name of diversity and inclusion, the people who suffer most often are first-gen students, lower-income students, students from rural areas, students of immigrant background, racial minorities, religious minorities. They're the people who are most likely to subscribe to these socially conservative and religious views. And real quick, last example, you can see this at work, how these attempts at diversity and inclusion can harm the very people they're trying to help. A lot of workplaces created these grievance procedures where you can anonymously report people who say or do the wrong thing. And the idea behind these anonymous reporting systems is that a lot of people who are more marginal in institutions, who are from underrepresented backgrounds, they don't feel as comfortable seeking the authorities, and there's actually a lot of research that's true. They don't feel as comfortable reporting to the authorities, and so if you create these anonymous systems, then people who are more marginal will feel more comfortable coming forward with the things that they have problems with in your organization. Okay, sounds good on paper. How does it work in practice? Well, two sociologists, Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev, published a paper in the Harvard Business Review that found that when workplaces create these anonymous grievance procedures, the effect that it has on whites is nil. It has no effect on white men, marginal negative effect on white women. The people who really suffer when these grievance procedures are initiated are managers who are non-white women, and especially managers who are non-white men. They get sanctioned, fired, disciplined, terminated at much higher rates than before the grievance procedures were created. And so the net effect of creating these grievance procedures in the name of diversity and inclusion is that it tends to purge management of non-whites. And it's actually easy to understand why you see this effect in practice, because again, it's non-whites and people from non-traditional backgrounds who are most likely to think the wrong things. They don't know what the right thing to say is. They don't say the right thing in the right way. They don't do the right thing when they're in social interactions. They don't behave the way that other professionals expect of them. And so there is this conformance pressure, and for people who are unable to conform, there often are penalties, or practical penalties. And this is a really unfortunate situation, something that we need to actively resist and try to understand in a deeper way. And one of the things I hope this book does is help start that conversation in a deeper way.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for sharing your personal story with us and how you got this book published. So moving on to our fifth question. In your introduction, you discussed how liberal academic elites' reactions to the 2016 election results were a clear demonstration of their class ignorance, as many in this group complained that they would be trampled under the power of the elites. Your book makes it clear that this phenomenon of elites who refuse to see their own privilege in society is an ongoing, long-term issue. Do you see this phenomenon repeating in academia with the 2020 and 2024 presidential elections?
I mean, I think that the great opening we're in right now wasn't driven by Trump, kind of predates Trump, and it persisted after him. And so I think when I look to 2024, I think the big thing that would happen if Trump were to win again wouldn't be another great awakening. I think because the awakening is on the downswing, the most likely reaction would be that there'd be a lot of dejection and anxiety and depression and blame shifting. I don't think you'd see the same kind of organized quote-unquote resistance movements that you saw after the 2016 election. There might be a little bit of it, but it probably won't be at the same level, it won't be at the same scale, it won't last as long, it won't be as organized. I think more than anything, probably what will happen is, rather than doubling down on social justice activism, a lot of people will blame, come to blame social justice activism for the reason why Trump got elected again, and that wouldn't be like, the answer there is kind of complicated. It's not entirely wrong, but it's also not entirely right. Okay.
Thank you. So our final question. You spoke about unintended consequences and limitations of contemporary activism. You explained how the work of woke elites at times is opportunistic, right? And it alienates minorities and doesn't quite speak to their experiences or preferences even. So politically speaking, this can lead to polarization, right? Even among minorities and underrepresented. So my question is isn't having the support of those elites and those in proximity to power, don't we need them? So, for progress and fostering real change, because they are the closest to the power. So what's the answer? Like, what alternative strategy do you have, or can you think of that would be effective in addressing systemic inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, so elites are helpful. There's not too many social movements that have succeeded without some kind of elite buy-in. But that said, I think there's this kind of self-interested way that we often think about this, where we go, oh, okay, so what I'll do is I'll make myself an elite, and then I'll be able to do all of this great good for people. And then when we find ourselves holding it back, we end up not doing so much good. And I think sometimes the focus on changing the elites is overemphasized. Like, it's not clear, for instance, how changing the corporate board at Goldman Sachs is going to necessarily lift anyone out of poverty or anything like this, right? And for a few reasons. One, in order to get a position on the board of Goldman Sachs, you have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. You have to actually conform. You're enculturated a certain way. You have to perform a certain set of things. You have to achieve a certain sort of things that show that you're the kind of person who belongs in Goldman Sachs. And the kinds of things that you have to do and the kinds of ways that you have to be enculturated are at odds in many respects, in a deep sense, with a lot of the kind of social justice ambitions that people have. And we saw this, actually. A good example of this, I did an essay in Compact magazine that I have a version of it on my Substack that's not paywalled. But you saw this, for instance, with respect to the Columbia protests. The protests at Columbia University after, starting last year after October 7th, and the subsequent Israeli campaign in Gaza. According to the kind of banal, identitarian thing, the fact that Monique Shafiq was a woman of Arab background, the first in Colombia's history, the first woman of Arab background and Muslim ancestry and whatever, the very first in Colombia's history, the idea would be, oh, well, okay, so Monique Shafiq would engage on this issue in a way that's different from other Columbia University presidents. She'd be more sympathetic, more understanding, more generous, and so on. Of course, she shares our identity, right? That's not the way it played out. She was actually, in some ways, more aggressive. She led this really intense crackdown on student protesters. When she was hauled before Congress, she made basically no effort to defend any of her colleagues or students. She made no spirited attempt to defend the role of the universities or the role in them, and so on. And the reason, as I illustrate in the article, the reason why you see this gap between reality and expectation in the case of Monique Shafiq is that Shafiq was more than just a brown Muslim, a brown woman of Muslim background. She was also the president of Columbia University. And Columbia University is an institution that fulfills a very specific set of social roles in society. Particularly what it does is it's an institution that exists to help identify people who should be elites and mark them as people who should be taken seriously, like myself. Now I'm worth listening to since I've been through Columbia University. And so the big thing that institutions, like the main thing that it does, I mean, we do other things. There are people who conduct research, there are people, and so on. But like the main thing that Columbia University does, its primary social function, is to generate inequality and to make people who are the winners in the social order feel like they earned it. So I'm there because I'm the smartest and the best and the brightest. That's why I got selected to Columbia University. And when my employer hires me on the basis of my Columbia degree, it's because I'm the best and the brightest and the most qualified. And so on. And so the whole point of Columbia is to reproduce and legitimize inequalities. That's its main social function. And so the idea that if you just replace some white guy and plug Shafiq into there, that somehow that's going to change the entire telos of this university and the fundamental way it operates is a fantasy. That's not the way it ever plays out in the world. And so I think we kind of overinvest in this idea that if we just replace the elites, who are these kind of straight white men with queer female minorities, that somehow all of these social problems will just disappear. That's just not the way the social world works. That's not the way institutions work. I think part of the reason why we gravitate towards that kind of approach is because we've grown really pessimistic about the prospect of mass movements. We just don't have confidence in our ability to, and so you can even see this in changes in student protesting. So for instance, in the 1950s and 60s, you had groups like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were organizing protests and marches and demonstrations and stuff, but they were focused largely off campus. They were a student organization, they were organizing people for protests, but off campus. They were going out into the world, rallying the community to take part in this broad-based civil rights movement. Okay, today, students on campus who participate in activism are almost entirely focused on campus and on reforms on campus, getting the president to make a certain statement, as if the president making a statement is going to save anyone's life in Gaza, or forcing or talking about institutional investments. And I think there's interesting conversation to be had about institutional investments, but the idea is it's this very narcissistic, inward-looking, like we're focusing on ourselves and our institutions and stuff, instead of going out into the world, because we just don't have confidence. I think a lot of us, we just don't have confidence in our abilities to engage with ordinary people, to mobilize with ordinary people, to build bonds with ordinary people. We've lost confidence in mass movements. And it is the case that we have grown more sociologically distant from normies. And this perception is felt by them and us. And so I think we've largely written off the idea of mass mobilization in order to achieve social justice goals, and I think that's unfortunate, because while it's true that you can't make social movements happen without elites, if you only were primarily focused on elites, if you make your whole social justice campaign around shifting chairs in the elite space, you're really not going to see radical substantive change, because everyone in the system has an interest in that system succeeding and flourishing. And that includes us in many cases, right? Yeah, so I think that it's absolutely a case that we need elites to focus, to help social movements succeed, but they can't be the primary focus. They really can't be.
Thank you for addressing our questions, and now we're going to invite the audience to ask any questions and join the conversation. And anybody who's interested in asking a question can just walk up to Ed here with the microphone. Please speak your question directly into the mic so that it can be recorded, it can be captured by audio. And then we'll post this audio recording on the NEIU Libraries website.
We do have a hard stop time in about 10-15 minutes, so please just try to keep your questions brief. And Dr. al-Gharbi, please try to keep answers short and integrate a lot of people into the conversation.
Thanks. Thanks, Ed. Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. I have a question, and I think the students were kind of trying to push you in this direction a little bit, so I want to follow this a little bit. I think a lot of us academic symbolic capitalists were socialized and educated to look at our work and to look at the world through this epistemology, what Paul Pickler calls the epistemology of suspicion. Right? We're trying to figure out what's hidden, what's wrong, critique it, and critique it, and critique it, and not necessarily propose any positive ways of engaging in the world, but emphasizing critique over everything else, right? And I don't know, because I haven't read your book, do you address this in the book? And I appreciate the way that you assume the ways that the book is a product of this same system of symbolic capital and the influence that the academic market has on it, right? So I don't know if you address this in your book at all. Do you have any very specific recommendations for how we symbolic capitalists should be engaging in the world?
Yeah, so as a spoiler, I end the book on I end the book on a willfully unsatisfying note. I just declined to do that. And there's a few reasons why I declined to do that, but one of them being Often when you read a book, it's like 12 chapters of describing a problem, and then here's my 12 steps, and like the 12 steps are usually not great, and it's like the least satisfying chapter. But that said, I think this question of what should we do instead is really important. It's like the question, right? It's the most important question. And so I have been thinking a lot about that. I'll say, this point you made about, I think it's true, it's absolutely true, that institutions of higher learning over-focus on developing students' critical capacities to the extent, to the exclusion of developing their affirmative capacities. So questions about like, what works, what actually works, why does it work, how does it work, what's good about the prevailing order, what are exemplars we can look to and build on? Like, these are not capacities that we're really developing in our students when they're in colleges and universities. We're focused on problematizing and deconstructing it, and so on. And this is a problem in two ways. It's a problem first because there's this phenomenon in social psychology called the default effect, which is that people tend to stick with the status quo even if they hate it, unless there's something better to replace it with. Something better, and not the lesser of two evils better, but genuinely good. In the absence of something genuinely good to replace the status quo with, people just stick with the status quo, even if it sucks, and even if everyone agrees that it sucks. And so if we want to actually achieve social change, then it's important for us to not just critique, but to build. We need to come up with some other alternative and build consensus around that alternative. And that requires us to cultivate and leverage our affirmative capacities. If we just sit there criticizing, we can criticize all day until the cow come home. We can make a whole library of criticisms, and nothing will change because we can't fight something with nothing, right? You need, and so that's the first way in which I think this kind of, actually I'll just leave it there because it's short, but I think you're absolutely right that it is important to kind of build out our affirmative capacities, and this is something we could do better in higher ed.
Hi, Dr. Ortiz. Thank you for your talk. My name is Adrian. I'm a faculty member here, just studying Latino studies. And I just had I was wondering throughout your presentation about if I haven't read your book either. So, but I was wondering if you already touched on that in the book. But I was wondering about if you thought about maybe some pushback that you'd receive from this argument, right, on the way that our socioeconomic standing upholds the status quo, like you mentioned. If you received any like pushback, or you anticipated any pushback, especially from folks who do like critical race theory and really center race and racism, and not like our socioeconomic standing in regards to the arguments that you make.
Yeah, I mean, so far the reception has been really positive in a way that disturbs me a little bit, actually. So like, for instance, the Washington Post called me the foremost sociological mind of my generation, and I don't even know what to do with that, and in any event, that was not my experience on the job market. Fox News I've been canceled by Fox News in the past, and maybe in the future. Okay, so I think so far the reception has been pretty positive, in part because I think a lot of the people who do work on things like feminism, critical theory, critical race theory, and like, those bodies of work influenced my own thinking profoundly. As a philosopher, I was a philosopher before I was a sociologist, and I was really influenced by feminist standpoint epistemology and queer theory. And then I have a degree in Middle East studies, and I was really influenced by post-colonial theory. It was precisely as a result of my engagement with critical race theory, post-colonial theory, queer theory, feminist standpoint epistemology, and stuff like this, that I came to understand and appreciate this relationship between ideology and power. And what I view myself as doing in a deep sense is taking the arguments from these literatures to what I view as their logical conclusion, which should lead us to ask, are these ostensibly emancipatory belief systems that we subscribe to? Why would we expect that they're immune to the same kinds of power and status moves that these scholars have critiqued for other forms of ideology? Why should we assume that our own ideological leanings are somehow exempt from that? So I'm applying these same narratives and arguments, these same modes of analysis, reflexively to ourselves and to our own ostensibly emancipatory belief systems. And when you read the book, you'll see people like Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw like, they're all over that book, and not in a way, not to criticize them, but to actually leverage them, to leverage their arguments in the service of exploring the thing in this book. And so I think a lot of readers will be surprised, and have been surprised, because maybe they were expecting it to be a takedown of some anti-woke street or something like that, and it's not. It's a serious effort to try to understand who benefits from social problems, how they persist, and why. And it actually engages with a lot of the literatures that people might assume I'm just critiquing or dismissing.
It seems like one of the things that you've noticed as you've been promoting the book is that people all pretend that they agree all the time. That seems to paper over a lot of disagreement that people aren't expressing. And I wonder if maybe one of the things that's changed over the last 100 years is that we've lost the ability to come to consensus and to agree about things. And this has resulted in a lot of work which is critical because people can always find fault with whatever is proposed. So it's not that your chapter about what to do would necessarily be bad, but we are no longer capable of coming together to affirm anything positive. Can we overcome that?
I mean, I think we can. One of the reasons why I don't, one of the additional reasons why I don't provide, like, here's my 12 steps, is because I did want readers to kind of sit with the weight of the kinds of challenges we face. Like, these are not small challenges. There aren't easy solutions, and the solutions that might work, they'll take painstaking consensus building and work often over the course of relatively long periods of time. In some cases, you know, years, decades even, right? And so I wanted to avoid the illusion of easy answers, quick fixes, things like that, and just have people sit with the monumental, with the extent of how profound these issues are. But that said, I do think that there's reason to hope that a lot of these social challenges can be mitigated. So, for instance, there's a sociologist, Patrick Sharkey, who does a lot of work on crime and on the kind of drops in crime that we saw since the 1980s, as he shows in this book. In his book about this, there's a lot of community organizations, people who are working on the ground, who are not affiliated with the state directly, and so on, who are able to build consensus and work within their communities to mitigate violence and help put people on different paths, and actually did play an enormous role in helping lead to this macro social change that we see with violent crime going down since the 1980s. So this is a big social change where people rolled up their sleeves in their communities and got to work and made stuff happen. And as well, another sociologist of mine on a similar had this book called Reform Nation that was about the passage of the First Step Act, which was the single biggest piece of criminal justice legislation that was passed in decades. It was signed into law under President Trump. But what Colleen shows in the book, what she illustrates, is this kind of painstaking, decades-long process of consensus building. I mean, even conservatives, right, had come to agree, even before the Great Awakening. Conservatives had been growing increasingly conscious of the fact that there were real problems in policing and incarceration, and that something needed to be done. And so there was this active persuasion that was very successful at changing minds and building consensus, allowing for the First Step Act to get passed and signed into law under a president who ran on a law and order kind of campaign, who would seem on paper to be the least sympathetic person you could imagine. The administration that you would 100% guess the First Step Act would never be passed under, they got signed into law under him, right? And so there are these efforts that you can see that have been underway, where you can see people building consensus in this kind of deliberate, painstaking way over time. Now, what Colleen's book also shows is how after the passage of the First Step Act, as a result in some ways of the ways that symbolic capitalists started engaging on criminal justice issues, you saw this consensus that had been building carefully over decades also fall apart really rapidly. And so rather than the First Step Act being the first step to a lot of other reform, it basically ended up being a capstone to this other reform that had been building over time, and nothing followed it. And in fact, in some respects, there's been some regression. And so again, this consensus building thing it's hard. It's hard to build consensus, it's hard to make consensus, to maintain consensus. But it's possible. It's actually possible if people are willing to put in the work, put in the effort of trying to persuade people who don't already agree with them, who are willing to extend charity to people who aren't already on board, to not just assume all these people are lost causes, dominated by a bunch of pathologies, they're just all a bunch of sexist, racist, homophobes that are barely worth just, even engaging with, and if anything, you just need to censor and purge them, right? So if we abandon that kind of a mentality and really take other people seriously as moral agents, as reasonable people who we can engage with despite disagreements, then it's possible to do this. It's actually possible to do this consensus building. It's happened. It's happening, right? And so I think the problem that we face as symbolic capitalists, again, is, if anything, a lack of confidence. We don't feel confident that we're able to do this. We don't trust the public. We don't trust in our ability to take part in mass movements with normies, not just with us, like mass movements of professionals in urban areas, but like build broad-based mass movements. We don't seem to have that confidence. And that's unfortunate, and that's what we need to build.
Thank you. With that, it's time to draw our conversation to a close. I'd like to end with some notes of appreciation and thanking the NEIU Libraries for hosting the event and for the Departments of History, Sociology, and Political Science for co-sponsoring it. Thank you to my fellow students, Diana and Jessica, for conducting the conversation with me, and for the audience to ask me all your good questions. Most of all, I'd like to invite the audience to join me in a round of applause to Dr. Musa al-Gharbi.